The grave, they say, waits for the final, rattling breath. But I, who have measured the shadow longer than the light, ask a more dreadful question. Does the grave truly wait for death? Or is it merely the final, merciful enclosure for a soul already entombed by premature maturity? We stand there, not on the threshold of a new investigation, but rather beside a crumbling, forgotten cradle, contemplating the most profound of human tragedies, the dissolution of innocence, not by the slow erosion of time, but by the instantaneous, terrifying flash of awareness. The theme that haunts our present communion is the spectral, pitiable figure of the child who grew old too soon, being cursed not by a short life, but by a consciousness too large for its fragile vessel, an intellect forced to confront the colossal dread of existence before its small hands could even fully grasp a toy. Look closely into the past, into the mist-shrouded recollections we call childhood. We are told it is an age of gilded sunlight, of simple joys, and of a blissful ignorance that shields the nascent mind from the chasm of mortality. But I suggest to you that this is a magnificent, though necessary, deception. Childhood is not the absence of terror. It is merely the time when terror has not yet acquired a definitive name. When that namitat, ultimate, shattering word that signifies loss, decay, and the irreversible march of Tamis, spoken directly into the child's ear. The transformation is immediate and devastating. The walls of the nursery dissolve, revealing the charnel house that underlies the foundation of the world. This child, the subject of our mournful study, does not merely lose exuberance, they lose futurity. They acquire the heavy, velvet cloak of existential burden, that knowledge that all joy is conditional, all beauty ephemeral, and all affection merely a prelude to separation. Imagine the terror of seeing the world through the cold, analytical lens of an octogenarian, yet lacking the accrued emotional callousness to withstand the sight. The premature awakening is a form of exquisite, psychological torture. It is akin to being trapped in a brightly lit dungeon, where the victim is forced to catalog every speck of dust, every drop of moisture, every minuscule symptom of decay, unable to turn away from the meticulously illuminated horror. What forces conspire to inflict this profound trauma? It is not always the obvious malice. So many times, the catalyst is the sheer proximity to overwhelming grief, a bereavement too massive for the small heart to process, leading instead to a retreat into icy, defensive intellect. Sometimes, it is the burden of responsibility, thrust upon shoulders too frail to bear it, forcing the child to perform the rigorous, unforgiving duties of an adult long before the biological and emotional structures are ready. And in the most spectral cases, it is an unwelcome gift of precocious sensitivity that acts as a psychic lightning rod, drawing down the atmospheric melancholy and the electric dread that perpetually hover above human society. This child is born with an old soul. Yes, but often, that old soul is nothing more than a pre-existing melancholia, a hereditary awareness of the futility encoded deep within the ancestral helix. We are speaking, therefore, of a life lived in reverse. A childhood haunted by the anxieties of old age. The laughter that should be effortless is strained. The games are rehearsed rituals rather than spontaneous effusions of delight. The spectral child possesses eyes that are tragically lucid, reflecting not the light of the present moment, but the long, attenuated shadow of events yet to come, the inevitable partings, the eventual decline, the utter silence that awaits us all. They are watchers, observers of life, rather than participants in it, alienated from their peers by a vast, incomprehensible gulf of premature experience. In the ensuing darkness, we shall dissect the manifestations of this Kershau. It surfaces in the quiet retreat, the obsessive preoccupation with logic and order, the profound, almost pathological fear of frivolity. We will consider the literary echoes of this phenomenon, from the tragic figures of Victorian literature to the silent, watchful children who populate my own haunted narratives. For this figure, the child, whose spirit has outpaced their years, is not merely a psychological anomaly. They are a profound commentary on the unbearable weight of consciousness itself. They are the living embodiment of the axiom that true knowledge is sorrow, and that perhaps the greatest mercy the universe grants is the slow, deliberate pace at which it usually allows us to discover the true nature of the grave. Prepare your minds for this descent. The path is narrow, and the atmosphere is thick with the dust of shattered dreams. We seek not to judge, but to understand the architecture of this peculiar ruin, the heart of a child, structurally sound, yet already bearing the moss and decay of 100 years. We proceed now descending from the initial contemplation of this tragedy into the swirling, abyssal depths of the maelstrom itself, an interior world of the child whose calendar years betray the age of their spirit. This is where the abstract terror takes on tangible, chilling form. The outward signs of a normal childhood, the fleeting enthusiasms, the passionate but shallow disputes, the innocent pursuit of the ephemeral are conspicuously absent. In their stead, we find a meticulous, almost ossified maturity, a tragic tableau of emotions that have been prematurely frozen by an insurmountable knowledge. The central tragedy of this premature ascent lies in the forfeiture of the invaluable shield of normal development is predicated upon a staggered, manageable introduction to the world's horrors. The universe gently reveals its claws, allowing the human spirit time to build its resilience. But for the child who grows old too soon, the revelation is total and instantaneous. They are suddenly thrust upon a precipice, forced to stare directly into the void that most adults only manage to glimpse fleetingly from the corner of a weary eye. Consider the nature of their solitude. The world of their peers is now alien, rendered hollow by their own unwelcome wisdom. The games of make-believe where reality is mutable, where monsters are easily defeated, and where mortality holds no dominion become cruel mockeries. How can one pretend to fear a shadow when one has already apprehended the structural inevitability of the ultimate shadow? This child rejects play not out of spite, but out of a deep, sorrowful recognition of its intrinsic falsehood. They cannot engage in the pleasant deception of childhood because they have already been initiated into the terrible, cold truth. Nothing is eternal, and even the strongest foundation is destined for dust. This intellectual isolation leads inevitably to a profound social alienation. The child becomes the observer, perpetually standing apart, watching the frantic, joyful motions of others with a mixture of pity and resentment. Their gaze is perhaps the most defining characteristic those days, dark and often unnervingly still, that seem to possess an impossible depth, reflecting not the light of the present but the heavy accumulation of past sorrows, both perceived and inherited. They are the eyes of someone who has witnessed a disaster unfold, even though the event itself lies decades in the future. What mechanisms does this soul deploy to cope with such overwhelming existential dread? Often, the intellect becomes a cruel, yet necessary, fortress. Logic, order, and rigorous analysis become substitutes for spontaneity and emotional connection. If the universe is chaotic and sorrowful, the internal life must be meticulously structured. They retreat into the realms of the quantifiable history or the bleak symmetry of philosophy, seeking solace in systems that promise permanence, even if that permanence is merely the predictable pattern of decay. This intellectual rigor is a desperate plea for control. If the heart cannot be protected from loss, perhaps the mind can categorize and predict the arrival of the next blow. This precocious obsession with order is, in essence, a profound fear of the unpredictable. Childhood is meant to be a period of joyous, chaotic experimentation. When this stage is skipped, the mind fears the unknown variables of human emotion and external fate, substituting emotional vulnerability with calculated distance. Every decision, every interaction, every passing moment is subjected to a relentless, unforgiving scrutiny and internal cross-examination that robs the present of its immediate vitality. The child does not merely live. They analyze the process of living, which is infinitely more exhausting and infinitely less rewarding. The maelstrom, therefore, is not an external storm. It is the ceaseless, self-destructive whirl of a mind too mature for its physical age, forever struggling to reconcile the vast, cold emptiness it perceives with the small, brightly colored world it is expected to inhabit. It is the perpetual discord between the internal sepulchral silence and the external cacophony of life. The result is a being who exists perpetually in the liminal space, a ghost among the living, a scholar among the naive, eternally trapped in the paradox of having known too much, too soon. The path now leads us deeper into the subterranean crypt of this premature consciousness, where the quiet logic of the previous stages begins to give way to the frantic rhythm of the correvolator, the telltale hartha constant, muffled drumming of unacknowledged grief that drives this young soul to seek sanctuary in the shadow. We must now dissect the very organ that bears the weight of this unbearable lucidity. The heart, too large and too fragile, beating a rhythm of perpetual alarm beneath the deceptive stillness of the mature exterior. The tragedy of the prematurely aged child is not merely intellectual. It is profoundly emotional, though the emotions are often suppressed beneath layers of calculated reserve. If the mind is the cold fortress, the heart is the prisoner within, desperately signaling its distress. This internal conflict manifests as a peculiar form of emotional stunting, disguised as sophistication. because they faced existential dread before they mastered simple human warmth. Their attempts at connection are often clumsy, analytical, or tragically brief. They understand love and attachment in theory as a necessary component of the social contract, but struggle terribly with the messy, illogical, and often reckless reality of deep human bonding. Consider the dynamic of their affection. It is often fervent, intense, and obsessively possessive, yet coupled with an almost prophetic fear of its inevitable termination, having been robbed of the carefree illusion of permanence. Every relationship, every friendship, every moment of shared joy is pre-calculated for its expiry date. They cannot invest fully, knowing, with chilling certainty, that the separation is guaranteed, whether by the simple vicissitudes of life or the ultimate, final silence. This foresight paralyzes the spirit, reducing potential joy into a complex cost-benefit analysis of future sorrow. They choose distance not because they are cold, but because they have already performed the grim arithmetic of loss, and the result is always too high a price to pay. And here, in this suffocating chamber of analysis, where the air grows heavy with the scent of dried tears and forgotten innocence, I feel compelled to pause our mutual exploration. If the chilling symmetry of this premature sorrow resonates within the recesses of your own soul, if you to feel the spectral touch of the child who knew too much, then I urge you, before we descend further into the final, darkest revelations, to acknowledge the connection. If you find yourself captured by the compelling dread of this psychological enigma, if the atmosphere of this reflection holds you fast as the grave holds its tenant, lend your spectral assent to this narrative. Subscribe to this discourse and mark your passage here with approval, lest this profound investigation into the nature of sorrow vanish like mist at the break of dawn. The influence of this hidden grief can become somatic, manifesting as an almost pathological need for control over their immediate environment. The child, unable to control the grand, terrifying forces of life and death, turns inward, seeking mastery over the minute details. This can range from an obsessive-compulsive need for immaculate arrangenta, desperate attempt to impose order onto a fundamentally chaotic existence, to an intense aversion to physical clutter, which they perceive as an external mirror of internal disarray. Every misplaced object is a subtle confirmation that the universe is slipping, irrevocably, into entropy. And the child fights this cosmic tendency with the relentless diligence of a sentinel guarding a lost cause. But the most insidious effect of this burden is the deep, pervasive sense of being perpetually unfit for joy. When a profound awareness of suffering is acquired too early, the innocent pursuit of pleasure can feel like a betrayal of frivolous disrespect for the magnitude of the world, enduring pain. They might smile, they might even laugh, but these expressions are often borrowed, meticulously studied from the faces of others, rather than bubbling forth from an untouched source of internal light. The light of genuine, spontaneous happiness has been replaced by the cold, steady beam of comprehension. They understand the mechanics of happiness, yet remain tragically incapable of experiencing its pure, unadulterated essence, forever standing outside the warm, brightly lit window, watching the dance unfold without them. This is the hard delator's confession, not a sin of malice, but the inescapable crime of knowing too much, too soon. Having traversed the melancholic terrain of the prematurely aged heart, we now enter the realm of the intellectual labyrintha enigma, where the burden of precociousness translates into philosophical and sometimes terrifying misinterpretations of reality. The child who grows old too soon begins to challenge not merely the structure of social expectations, but the very fabric of perceived truth, viewing the world through a lens of profound skepticism that few adults ever achieve. The central enigma is how such a limited framework of experience can generate such colossal, conceptual understanding. The answer, I believe, lies in the intense, concentrated nature of their focus. When innocence is shattered, the fragments are not discarded. They are meticulously examined, lacking the distractions of adult life, the pursuit of wealth, the complexities of romance, the demands of vocation. This child focuses the entire, formidable power of their nascent intellect upon the fundamental questions. Why do we suffer? What is the nature of time? And, most crucially, what is the structure of the void that awaits us all? This preoccupation with existential fundamentals leads to a curious, often unnerving detachment. The child begins to perceive human life, including their own, less as a vibrant, immediate experience and more as a detailed case study. They become adept at recognizing patterns of hypocrisy, self-deception, and the subtle malignancies that infect human interaction. They see the fear beneath the bravado, the desperation beneath the ambition, and the deep, silent loneliness that permeates even the grandest social gathering. They observe the mechanical dance of society with a critical objectivity that makes them seem unsettlingly wise. They see the strings, and the realization that they too are puppets in this grand, sorrowful theater only amplifies their sense of isolation. This premature philosophical development often manifests as an obsession with the unseen or the macabre. Because they have been robbed of the comforting illusion of permanence, they are drawn to what is left, the shadow, the ruin, the lingering presence of what once was. They might display a morbid fascination with graves, with forgotten histories, or with tales of decay and spectral visitation. This is not mere adolescent gloom. It is an intellectual attempt to normalize the ultimate terror. If the decay is understood, catalogued, and rendered predictable, perhaps its power can be diminished. They study death as a scientist studies an insect pinned to a board mat, out of love for the subject, but out of a desperate need to understand its mechanism. Furthermore, their relationship with language itself becomes an enigma. They often possess a vocabulary and a rhetorical flourish far beyond their years, employing language not merely for communication, but as a precise instrument for dissection. Their words are chosen for maximum impact and minimal ambiguity, reflecting their deep disdain for the careless, vague language used by those who still live in the comfortable fog of unawareness. They speak the language of analysis, a tongue that often falls coldly upon the ears of those who prefer the warmth of sentiment. This linguistic precision acts as yet another barrier, confirming their status as perpetual outsiders. The greatest challenge the prematurely aged child poses to observers is in understanding their capacity for cruelty, or what might appear as such. Because their emotional development has been bypassed by their intellectual growth, they can sometimes appear ruthless, making logical decisions that disregard the tender, illogical needs of the heart. If a relationship is logically deemed unsustainable, they sever it cleanly, without the messy, lingering remorse that would afflict a normal mind. This apparent coldness is not born of malice, but of a purely analytical adherence to efficiencia, commitment to minimizing the long-term suffering by excising the source of pain immediately. They are the surgical knife in a world that prefers the slow, dull ache of a festering wound. This detachment is their armor, but it is also their greatest, most tragic weakness, sealing them within the cold geometry of their own making. The enigma remains. Can a soul so burdened by insight ever truly find warmth again? We arrive now at the apex of our morbid pilgrimage, the climax of the Raven, where the accumulated dread and premature wisdom of the aged child reach their inevitable, chilling synthesis. This is the moment of tragic clarity, where the relentless analysis of existence forces a confrontation with the ultimate, unbearable realization. The child's profound insight is not a superpower, but a fatal flaw, a curse that ensures their perpetual exile. The climax of this psychological drama is the full, undeniable recognition by the individual that they are permanently dissociated from the temporal rhythm of human life. They realize that the gap separating them from their peers and indeed from the vast majority of mankind is not merely one of experience, but of fundamental perception. While others navigate life's complexities relying on hope, sentiment, and the blessed illusion of endless tomorrows, the prematurely aged soul operates solely on the cold, hard currency of statistical probability and the cruel certainty of entropy. This moment of synthesis forces a devastating internal paradox. The child, having intellectually mastered the mechanisms of life and death, still retains the innate human need for warmth, acceptance, and meaning. Yet, their very knowledge renders these needs unattainable on normal terms. How can one seek comfort in a relationship when one has already written the final, sorrowful conclusion? How can one find motivation in ambition when the futility of all mortal striving has been apprehended with absolute intellectual rigor? The intellect provides the answers, but those answers are bleak, leaving the emotional core starved and screaming in silence. The true climax, therefore, is the moment the child ceases fighting the tide and succumbs to the knowledge of their own spectral nature. They understand, perhaps more clearly than anyone, that they are a contradiction, a being of relentless analytical maturity housed in a vessel that demands protection and nurturing. They realize the profound irony. Their greatest strengths are unique. Precocious insight is the very instrument of their psychological undoing. They have paid for wisdom with joy, and the transaction is irreversible. This realization often leads to an intensified state of melancholic withdrawal. The previous stages involved analytical observation. This stage involves resignation. The world ceases to be a puzzle to be solved and becomes merely a stage upon which predictable, sorrowful dramas are endlessly reenacted. The individual begins to cultivate a deep, almost romantic appreciation for melancholy itself, not as a fleeting mood, but as the only authentic state of being. The silence, the shadow, the ruined architecture of lost times become more comforting than the blinding, false glare of conventional happiness. They retreat into a philosophical where the only company is the unblinking awareness of their own mortality and the mortality of everything they might ever hold dear. This acute awareness often produces a distinct literary or artistic sensibility, desire to render their profound alienation into form. The poetry they write is too old, the music they compose too somber, the art they create too obsessed with shadow and decay. Their work is a desperate attempt to communicate the incommunicable terror of their condition, to externalize the spectral burden they carry. Yet, because the world thrives on comfortable illusions, their art is often dismissed as unduly morbid, excessive, or simply too much for its supposed author. They are misunderstood even in their attempts to reveal the core of their being. The ultimate, climactic weight rests on the profound loneliness. The raven's message is not merely nevermore. It is the echoing certainty that no one else truly understands the magnitude of the nevermore that this soul has known since its earliest years. They are trapped in the prison of their own consciousness, separated from humanity by a glass wall of devastating clarity. They see and hear everything, but their attempts to touch or be touched are always muffled, always refracted, eternally hampered by the suffocating weight of knowledge. This solitary state is the definitive, tragic achievement of the child who grew old too soon. We draw the velvet curtains now on this mournful investigation, stepping back from the abyss to consider the haunting echo of the message final and the legacy. What enduring philosophical truth can we extract from the ruins of a childhood prematurely consumed by the very act of knowing? The legacy of the child who grew old too soon is not merely a tale of individual woe. It is a profound, albeit agonizing, commentary on the nature of consciousness itself. Their life serves as a spectral warning. The human spirit is designed for a degree of controlled ignorance. True happiness, perhaps, is predicated on the ability to postpone, to deflect, or occasionally to outright deny the grim arithmetic of existence. The soul that is robbed of this protective veil is a soul condemned to the constant, flickering awareness of the finite, the ephemeral, and the ultimately meaningless trajectory of mortal striving. The profound message is one of necessary illusion. We are taught to praise wisdom, to seek knowledge, and to pierce the veil of surface reality. Yet, the price paid by the precocious mind suggests that there is a dreadful point of diminishing point where insight crosses the boundary from enlightenment into debilitating terror. The adult world functions because it collectively agrees to ignore the noise of the telltale heart beating beneath the floorboards. The child who grows old too soon has, tragically, heard that noise too clearly, too early, and can never unhear it. Their legacy urges us to consider the sanctity of innocence, not as a lack of intelligence, but as a crucial, psychological defense mechanism. Innocence is the temporary, self-imposed blindness that allows the soul to gather the strength required to face the inevitable clarity of maturity. When this phase is violently abbreviated, the foundational structure of the self is compromised. We see, through their experience, that the greatest burden is not suffering itself, but the premature certainty of future suffering. In the end, this figure forces us to confront our own relationship with time. The normal human perceives time as a linear progression from youth to maturity, a slow walk toward the horizon. The spectral child perceives time not as a progression, but as a fixed, terrifying loop. The beginning already contains the ending, and the brief interval between is merely the excruciating process of filling in the predetermined details. Their life is thus a sustained act of philosophical defiance, a silent scream against the clock that ticks too fast. And so, we leave this darkened chamber of reflection, bearing the weight of this unique sorrow. If the intensity of this analysis has awakened in you a similar dread, a recognition of the shadows that cling even to the brightest moments, then let the world know that you too have wrestled with the profound questions of existence. I implore you, if this spectral journey has compelled your attention and carved a deep line of thought upon your mind, share this discourse with those few souls who dare to look beyond the immediate glare of the mundane. Disseminate this morbid truth, that others might understand the terrible beauty of too much knowledge, too soon. The fate of the child who grew old too soon is not necessarily physical death, but the far more harrowing demise of the youthful spirit. They become the quiet observers of their own incomplete lives, perpetually waiting for the world to catch up to the age of their spirit. They taught us that the human spirit, when subjected to truth without compassion, will inevitably fracture. They walk among us, these lucid, wounded souls. A silent reminder that perhaps the most merciful illusion is the one that allows us to believe, even for a brief, golden moment, that the raven will, one day, utter a different word. Do not seek the answers. Merely recognize the abyss. For when you finally stare into the depth of your own existence, you will realize that you have known the silence of the grave since the day you were born.